Oh, didn't see you there.
Apples
Witches?
and dwarves.
No, this is not Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones.
Today on Course Crash English Literature, we're going to be analyzing one of the most classic tales of all time, Snow White.
Storytelling has long been used as not only a form of entertainment for all ages, but also a way to teach lessons and morals. From Norse tales regarding the wisdom of Odin to Middle Eastern adventures like Aladdin, hidden underneath the plot and characters are messages that authors are trying to convey to their audiences. While seemingly innocent in modern times, all these stories have darker origins, with characters suffering more severe consequences and narratives depicting harsh realities.
Snow White's story has long been a staple of contemporary fairy tales in media. Ever since Disney release in 1837, Snow White has become a household name and a part of every person's childhood. However, the story was first published in Germany in 1810. Since then, each iteration of the story has taken on cultural influences, but it has retained its basic story structure. The evil queen abuses Snow White and asks her to be killed because of her own vanity and insecurity. Then Snow White meets friends who take her in and protect her. She then meets her true love, to the dismay of the queen. Finally, Snow White becomes a princess and lives happily ever after. A prevalent theme throughout the fairy tale is the contrast between the queen's skin-deep beauty versus Snow White's physical and inner beauty. In all versions of the author conveys the message that acting on one's insecurity often leads to rash decisions that can harm the innocent and those close to you.
Oh, shoot, sorry.
The Disney animated film of Snow White was based off the original German version written by the Grimm brothers. In this story, there was a queen who was the most beautiful woman in the land, and she would constantly confirm this through her use of her magic mirror. As her child, Snow White reached the age of 7, the magic mirror confirmed that she was no longer the most beautiful woman, but her daughter had stolen the spotlight. The queen immediately ordered her daughter to be killed, but Snow White escaped, causing her to seek refuge in the home of the 7 dwarves. The queen constantly attempted to kill Snow White, but failed until one day she managed to poison her with an apple. Once again, the queen was the most beautiful woman in the land, and the dwarves preserved Snow White's body within a glass coffin. One day, a prince came to the home of the dwarves seeking a place to stay for the night. But when he saw that Snow White was in the coffin, he immediately fell in love. He brought her back to his palace and ordered his servants to follow him around everywhere he goes while carrying the coffin of Snow White. Since this was such strenuous work, one of his servants could not control their anger and slapped the back of Snow White's head. After the impact, a piece of apple that was lodged within her throat came out of her mouth, and she was alive once again. The prince and Snow White were immediately married and even invited the queen to the wedding. This version of Snow White depicts how the mother's envy trumps her ability to think rationally and causes her to constantly attempt to murder Snow White in order to achieve her goal of becoming the fairest in all the land. Although the queen temporarily maintained the title of the most beautiful woman, Snow White's physical and inner beauty was able to overcome her mother's superficial beauty, leading to her ultimately taking back the title of the fairest in the land. Snow White was also able to gain much more than a title through her all encompassing beauty. She gained 7 loyal companions, the dwarves, and a prince who would maintain a long lasting love for her.
The story of Snow White was also prevalent in other areas of Europe. In particular, a Portuguese version was written in the 19th century by Zofimo Pedroso. He was a political activist in Portugal at the time and was famous for his expert writing ability. He was also very interested in the ethnography and anthropology of the Portuguese. This is what led him to write Portuguese folktales, the first series of folktales from the country. In his version of the story, there is not as much tragedy, and much of the fantasy is replaced by a bit more realistic view. As per usual, it begins with an evil queen asking her mirror if there is anyone more beautiful than her. Upon learning that her stepdaughter is, she has her servants go out and kill her. However, her kindness dissuades them, and they instead tell her to run far away and protect herself. They end up returning a dog's tongue to the queen.
The princess, or Snow White, wanders until she finds a house with a lot of pigs. She decides to make food, but the owner soon returns and asks whether Snow White will be his wife or daughter. She obviously chooses daughter, and they begin to live together. Snow White walks around the forest to amuse herself and on 2 occasions sees the prince looking for her. She runs back in fear, however. The queen is worried for her son, since a doctor literally said that he is lovesick. The queen then sends a proclamation for her guards to go and get Snow White to come to the castle. Snow White tells the guards that the queen would have to come to her place, which upsets the queen at first. However, the queen does end up going to Snow White's house, and upon arriving, the house turns into a palace. Her father becomes an emperor, and the pigs turn into lords and dukes. Seeing this, the queen begs Snow White to marry her son, which she does. Everyone lived happily ever after. The Portuguese take of Snow White is clearly less dramatic and fantasy-filled, at least when compared to the German version. The main theme of the story, however, remains relatively the same. The queen's vanity and insecurity lead her to make an evil decision to kill Snow White. However, Snow White's inner beauty helps to keep her safe, and this is the difference that makes Snow White truly beautiful compared to the queen. This version also paints Snow White as a much more innocent character. This is best seen by having her act as the man's daughter and immediately running away from the prince when she sees him in the forest. Another major event is painting the queen as a much more human character and not purely evil. For the sake of her son's health, she does something potentially demeaning by following the orders of a commoner and going to her house. Pedroso thus touches upon the moral ambiguity in this way. Finally, the transformation of Snow White and her humble life into a grand royal life are a clear symbol of Snow White's inner beauty manifesting into the real world. Might go a little bit more. Okay, good.
Moving 1,000 miles west of Portugal, we arrive at the origin of our next version of Snow White, Italy. Written by Laura Godzenbach in 1980, this modernized version of Snow White is titled Maria and the Seven Robbers. Godzenbach, who received a degree in Italy for literature and authentic Italian cuisine, drew from various stories she had heard from around Swiss-German community in Sicily she had grown up in. During this time of hardship from which she drew her stories, thievery was very common, and parents often gave their children to orphanages to sustain their own lives. This version of Snow White begins with Maria and her father trying to cope with the recent death of her mother. After a year's worth of interactions between Maria's teacher and her father, they fall in love and decide to marry each other, making the teacher Maria's new stepmother. While Maria's stepmother had once been very kind towards her as a teacher, she suddenly became very unfriendly after marrying her father. One day when Maria's stepmother suggests that their father should get rid of Maria because she eats too much of their bread, her father disagrees. But after much discussion, the stepmother finally agreed to not kill Maria, but instead leave her in the woods so she couldn't find her way home. After a few days, the family went on a trip to the countryside to go hiking. Maria, suspicious of her mother, decided to bring Bran with her and leave a trail in case anything happened. While passing by a cliff, her father accidentally drops the bread they brought with them, prompting Maria to climb down the cliff and retrieve it. Upon climbing back up, Maria realizes that her father and stepmother had ditched her and left her for dead. Luckily, Maria follows the bread back home to a very angry stepmother, who thought she was dead. After this failed attempt, her stepmother makes Maria's father take her into the woods again to repeat this without the bran. This time, Maria is really lost and wanders frantically until she stumbles into the house of the seven robbers. Not long after she arrived and cleaned and cooked the house for the seven robbers, she was discovered and welcomed into the home. One day, a poor old lady came back to the house and she asked for alms because she was so poor. When the old lady asked why, Maria told her the story of how she ended up in the house of the seven robbers. Once the old lady heard this, she hurried over to the house of the wicked stepmother and informed her. Furious, the stepmother poisoned a ring for the old lady to give to Maria, and later the old lady went to the house and offered Maria the ring, which was so beautiful that she couldn't reject it. Not long after she put the ring on, she fell to the ground as if she were dead. To the robbers' surprise, they came home to find her in this state of unconsciousness. Weeping, they decided to put her in a glass coffin to preserve her beauty and presented her to the young king of the land. For many days the king wept by the coffin until the mother decided to remove the ring to preserve it. Suddenly Maria's eyes fluttered open as she came back to life and eventually married the king. The Italiano version of Snow White seems to draw from many more fables than just the original Snow White. For example, the trail that Maria leaves alludes to Hansel and Gretel, while being left in the forest after climbing down a cliff and back up again is similar to my own life. The main theme of the story also is altered in this version, changing from the queen's insecurity to a stepmother's pure malice and Maria's resilience. Unlike other versions of Snow White, this version also has the presence of a fatherly figure. Steering away from the more common role of the male character, Maria's father takes on a less dominant role in the household. Instead of keeping his own daughter safe, he lets Maria's teacher come into their family and kick Maria out, and in the end, it is Maria's willpower that ultimately allows her to survive.
It is evident in all the stories that the queen's pride and vanity eventually leads to her downfall. By trying to kill Snow White in order to become the most beautiful, she loses the humanity of her outer beauty. Across the cultures, the stories warn against insecurity and rash decisions. In addition, they preach that staying humble and kind will eventually reward you with success and happiness. In most versions, the mirror also stands as a symbol of vanity. The interactions with the mirror and the queen are to warn against comparing yourself against others to determine your self-worth. Finally, Snow White's satisfaction with her life, regardless of circumstance, might have helped lower and middle class people in Europe be more comfortable and happy with their lives.
The story of Snow White has transcended time due to its basic teaching regarding self-worth and happiness. Thus, it's important in culture to teach young kids to value their inner beauty and kindness over their physical appearance. It helps drive home the fact that being attractive does not necessarily make you a good person. In addition, the story helps teach people to be friendly and kind with those around them in order to have a good support system to help them in the future. These important values are not found in most other fairy tales, which is why Snow White is so well known across culture and time. Thank you for watching this video of Course Crash English Literature. Join us next week when we explore White Snow and the 7-foot troll. Please make sure to like, subscribe, and join the notification squad. Are you gonna demolish? Are you saying?
Oh wait, I thought we were just gonna have Salvin say it. Yeah.
Oh my god.
Salvin,
Wait, get on saying.
Say smash that like button.
Say absolutely demolish that like button.
No, I'm good.
No, dude, Salvin.
What?
Say
Just
it.
say
Absolutely
No,
demolish that
like
like
with a
button.
lot
yell
of
it.
enthusiasm.
Yeah, I just did. What?
Say like absolutely demolish that like button.
Absolutely demolish that like button. Alright. Good?
Yeah. Bye, Salvin.
Bye.
I can't believe we got good footage.